Before dating apps, before choosing your own partner, was even a widespread idea. There was the marriage market. And let me tell you, it wasn't always a fairy tale. Imagine being legally considered your husband's property, or being married off at an age when you'd still be playing with dolls. Think about a world where not marrying meant social ruin, or where your entire future depended on the size of a payment exchanged between families. This isn't fiction. For countless people throughout history, this was the reality of finding a spouse. Get ready to see how this market often left individuals with very few good choices, if any at all. Number 15. The pressure cooker of procreation. For a vast stretch of human history, and in many cultures, the absolute primary purpose of marriage was not love, companionship, or personal fulfillment, but the creation of heirs. This was particularly true for noble families, royal lines, and any family with property or a name to carry on. A woman's worth was often directly tied to her fertility. If a wife did not produce children, particularly sons, the consequences could be dire. She might face social ostracism. Her husband could take another wife if customs allowed, or she could even be repudiated or divorced, left with little social standing or economic support. Think about the immense psychological pressure on individuals. A young woman entering a marriage knew that her primary expectation was to conceive and bear healthy children. Every month, without a pregnancy, could increase anxiety and scrutiny from her husband, her in-laws, and the wider community. If she suffered miscarriages or stillbirths, she might be blamed, accused of some failing, or even witchcraft in some periods. Men, too, faced pressure. If a union was childless, the man's virility might be questioned, though often the blame fell disproportionately on the woman. This intense focus on procreation often overshadowed any other aspect of the marital relationship. Personal compatibility, affection, shared interests. These could be bonuses, but they were secondary to the biological imperative dictated by societal need and the desire to continue a lineage. Imagine the silent suffering of couples who, for whatever medical reasons unknown to them at the time, could not conceive. Their personal tragedy became a public failure, a mark against them in the ledger of societal expectations. The marriage, in the eyes of many, had failed its core purpose, regardless of any love or support that might have existed between the spouses. This relentless demand for children turned marriage into a high-stakes gamble for biological success, often leaving those who failed to produce offspring marginalized and unfulfilled in the one role society truly valued for them. The emotional toll of this singular focus, the years spent hoping, trying, and facing disappointment while society looked on critically, is hard to fully comprehend from our modern perspective, where family planning and diverse life choices are more widely accepted. Number 14. The invisible chains of coverture. Let's talk about a legal doctrine that shaped the lives of married women in England and its colonies, including early America, for centuries: coverture. When a woman married, her legal identity was subsumed by that of her husband. She became a feme covert, a covered woman. This meant she could not own property in her own name. Any land, money, or possessions she brought into the marriage or earned during it legally belonged to her husband. She could not enter into contracts, sue, or be sued in her own right, or write a will without her husband's permission. Essentially, in the eyes of the law, the husband and wife were one person, and that person was the husband. Imagine a woman from a wealthy family bringing a substantial dowry into her marriage. Once the vows were exchanged, control over that wealth passed to her husband. He could manage it, spend it, or even squander it, and she often had little legal recourse. If she worked, her wages belonged to him. If she inherited property, It became his to control. This wasn't just about money, it was about autonomy. A married woman had severely limited ability to act as an independent individual in the public or economic sphere. While some husbands might have been kind and managed joint assets responsibly, the law provided little protection against those who were negligent, abusive, or simply bad with money. The idea was that the husband would protect and provide for his wife, but the system left women incredibly vulnerable if that protection and provision failed. Even her physical person was, to a degree, under his control. While the harshest interpretations of a husband's right to chastise his wife faded over time, the fundamental lack of legal personhood remained a powerful constraint. It took decades, even centuries, of legal reforms, often hard-fought by pioneering women and their allies, to begin chipping away at coverture and grant married women basic property rights and legal standing. Think about the frustration of a talented, intelligent woman unable to use her skills or resources to build her own security or pursue her own ventures because the law rendered her legally invisible without her husband. Number 13. When love was a dangerous luxury. In many historical contexts, particularly among the upper classes and nobility, marriage was primarily a strategic alliance, not a love match. Marriages were arranged to consolidate wealth, forge political ties, acquire land, or secure peace between warring factions. Love was a secondary consideration, if it was considered at all. Choosing a spouse based on personal affection or romantic attraction could be seen as frivolous, irresponsible, or even detrimental to family interests. Young people, especially young women, often had little to no say in who they would marry. Their parents or guardians made the decision based on what was best for the family unit, the estate, or the dynasty. A daughter might be married off to an aging but powerful nobleman to secure a family's position, or a son might be wed to an heiress to bolster the family coffers, regardless of any personal feelings or compatibility. Trying to pursue a marriage based on love against the wishes of one's family could lead to disinheritance, social ruin, or even forced confinement. Romantic love, as we understand it, was often something that happened outside of marriage in clandestine affairs, or was celebrated in poetry and song as an idealized, often unattainable concept, rather than a foundation for a lifelong partnership. The expectation was that affection, or at least a working companionship, might develop over time within the arranged marriage. But if it didn't, individuals were expected to endure the match for the sake of duty and family honor. This system undoubtedly led to many unhappy, unfulfilled individuals trapped in loveless unions. Imagine being bound for life to someone you barely knew, or perhaps even disliked, for reasons entirely outside your control. The market in these cases was driven by cold, hard calculation, with human hearts and desires often a very low priority. Pain of such unions, the longing for genuine connection, is a recurring theme in the literature and personal diaries of these periods, a testament to the human cost of prioritizing strategy over sentiment in matters of the heart. Number 12. The dowry trap. The dowry system, prevalent in many cultures across Europe, Asia, and Africa for centuries, was a transfer of parental property, gifts, or money upon the marriage of a daughter. While intended to provide the bride with some security in her new home or to help the new couple establish their household, it often became a significant burden and a source of immense pressure, particularly for families with multiple daughters. If a family could not provide a suitable dowry, their daughter might be considered unmarriageable, or she might have to marry beneath her social station. This could lead to a lifetime of spinsterhood, often a marginalized and economically precarious existence for women, or a less advantageous match. The size of the dowry could determine the quality of the husband a woman could attract. Families would go to great lengths, sometimes into severe debt, to accumulate an impressive dowry for their daughters. Pressure could be immense. In some extreme cases, the inability to pay a dowry or disputes over its amount or payment could lead to abuse of the bride by her new family, or even in more modern times in certain regions, to dowry-related violence. The focus on the dowry often shifted the perception of the marriage from a union of two people to an economic transaction. The bride herself could be seen almost as an appendage to the wealth she brought. Conversely, if a bride brought a substantial dowry, she might have more influence in her new household, but this was not guaranteed. The system also meant that a woman's value in the marriage market was explicitly tied to her family's wealth. A poor but virtuous and intelligent woman might be overlooked in favor of a wealthier but perhaps less suitable bride. The desperation to secure dowries could lead families to make sacrifices that affected all their children, for instance, by skimping on a son's education to save for a daughter's marriage portion. The system, while having various origins and intentions, frequently created a high-stakes financial game around marriage, where a woman's future prospects were heavily dictated by the economic assets she represented. Number 11. No exit. The impossibility of divorce. For much of Western history, particularly under the influence of strong religious doctrines, marriage was considered a sacrament, an indissoluble bond until death do us part. Divorce, as we understand it today, a legal termination of a valid marriage allowing both parties to remarry, was virtually unobtainable for the vast majority of people. In England, for instance, before 1857, a full divorce requiring an act of Parliament was incredibly expensive and complex, accessible only to the very wealthy and powerful, and usually only granted on grounds of adultery by the wife. Annulments, which declared that a valid marriage had never existed in the first place, due to reasons like consanguinity or non-consummation, were possible, but also difficult to obtain. For most people, a bad marriage was a life sentence. If a marriage was abusive, loveless, or simply miserable, there was often no way out. A wife suffering from a cruel or neglectful husband had very few options. She could try to seek a legal separation, a divorce from bed and board, which allowed them to live apart but did not permit remarriage. But this was also not easy to secure and often left the woman in a precarious financial and social position. Men had somewhat more freedom, as they could more easily abandon a wife or live openly with a mistress, though they too could not legally remarry. This lack of an exit route meant that many people were trapped in deeply unhappy situations. The social and religious stigma against even separated individuals was significant. The failure of a marriage was seen as a personal and moral failing. This system forced people to endure circumstances that today would be considered intolerable. The inability to dissolve a marriage and seek happiness elsewhere meant that the initial choice of a partner, often made with limited information, under family pressure, or at a very young age, had lifelong, irreversible consequences. The marriage market wasn't just about getting in, it was also about being unable to get out, no matter how disastrous the union turned out to be. Number 10. Spinsterhood, the social pariah. In many historical societies, a woman's primary identity and social standing were derived from her status as a wife and mother. An unmarried woman, particularly one past a certain age, was often viewed with a mixture of pity, suspicion, and sometimes contempt. Term spinster, originally a neutral term for a woman who spins thread, gradually took on negative connotations, implying someone unwanted, unchosen, or somehow deficient. While some women chose not to marry or were unable to for various reasons, lack of a suitable dowry, scarcity of eligible men perhaps due to war or personal preference, society often did not look kindly upon this status. Economically, life could be very difficult for an unmarried woman unless she came from a wealthy family. Job opportunities were severely limited, often restricted to low-paying domestic service, governess roles, or relying on the charity of relatives. Socially, spinsters could be marginalized, excluded from couple-oriented events, and seen as a burden on their families. There was an underlying assumption that something was wrong with a woman who did not marry. Was she too plain, too poor, too difficult in temperament? The pressure to marry was immense, as it was the main pathway to social acceptance and economic security for women. For a woman to fail in the marriage market meant facing a future where she might be perpetually dependent, without her own household, and often without the respect afforded to married women. This societal attitude created a climate where women might feel compelled to accept undesirable marriage proposals, rather than face the stigma of spinsterhood. The alternative to marriage was often not a life of independent fulfillment, but one of societal disapproval and economic vulnerability. This painted the marriage market as less of a choice and more of a compulsory institution for women, with dire social consequences for those who remained outside its bounds. The old maid stereotype, often portrayed unkindly in literature and popular culture, reflects the societal discomfort with women who didn't fit the prescribed wife and mother mold. Number 9. Tiny hands, heavy vows. Child marriage. Throughout history and across various cultures, the practice of child marriage was alarmingly common. Girls, and sometimes boys well below the age of puberty, could be betrothed or even formally married. These unions were typically arranged by families for reasons of alliance, economic benefit, or perceived social stability. The children involved had no say in the matter. Their consent was not sought, nor was it considered relevant. While consummation of the marriage might be delayed until puberty, the girl was legally bound and often sent to live with her husband's family at a very young age. Imagine a child of 8 or 10 removed from her own family, placed in a new and unfamiliar environment, and expected to eventually fulfill wifely duties. The physical and psychological consequences could be devastating. Early pregnancy and childbirth, before a girl's body was fully developed, led to high rates of maternal and infant mortality, as well as debilitating conditions like obstetric fistula. These young brides were deprived of their childhood, their education, and any opportunity to make choices about their own lives. Their primary role was defined before they could even understand what it entailed. While some societies had minimum ages for marriage, these were often very low by modern standards. For example, in medieval Europe, canon law allowed girls to marry at 12 and boys at 14, though local customs sometimes varied. The focus was on securing lineage and property, and children were pawns in these larger familial strategies. The marriage market, in these instances, was dealing in futures not yet formed, in lives barely begun. The long-term impact on the well-being of these children, particularly girls, was profound, stripping them of agency and exposing them to significant risks. This practice shows how the concept of individual choice and well-being was often entirely absent from marriage negotiations, with children treated as assets to be exchanged. Number 8. The barren curse, infertility, stigma. While we touched on the pressure to procreate, the specific stigma attached to infertility, particularly female infertility, deserves its own focus. In societies where a woman's primary value was her ability to bear children, barrenness was often seen not just as a personal tragedy but as a divine curse, a sign of personal failing, or even a result of witchcraft or sin. Childless wife could face immense social shame and pressure. Her husband might be encouraged by his family or community to take another wife if polygyny was practiced, or to divorce or repudiate her. She might be ostracized, ridiculed, and treated as an outcast. The emotional burden was enormous. Without the status of motherhood, her position in the family and society was often precarious. Even if the infertility was due to the husband, the blame almost invariably fell upon the woman. Medical understanding of fertility was limited, and folk remedies or religious rituals were often the only recourse, frequently proving ineffective and adding to the woman's distress. In some cultures, intricate and often humiliating rituals were performed to try and cure barrenness. If these failed, it further confirmed the woman's perceived inadequacy. This intense focus on fertility meant that a woman's body was not truly her own. It was a vessel for the continuation of the family line. If it failed in this duty, she was often deemed a failure as a woman and a wife. The marriage market, therefore, implicitly or explicitly screened for perceived fertility. A young woman known to have health issues that might affect childbearing, or even from a family with a history of childless women, might find her marriage prospects diminished. The fear of being unable to conceive hung heavy over many women, transforming the joy of marriage into an anxious waiting game, with social acceptance hanging in the balance. Number 7. Marrying for money, not honey. Economic necessity. For a vast number of people throughout history, especially those not in the landed or wealthy classes, marriage was at its core and economic partnerships essential for survival. Love and attraction were bonuses, but the primary consideration was often whether a potential spouse could contribute to the household economy. A man looked for a wife who was strong, healthy, and skilled in domestic tasks, cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, childcare, and perhaps agricultural work. A woman looked for a husband who could provide, who had a trade, land, or steady employment, and who could offer physical protection. Without a spouse, life could be incredibly harsh. A single man might struggle to maintain a household without a wife to manage domestic affairs. A single woman, as discussed, faced limited economic opportunities and social vulnerability. Therefore, the marriage market was heavily influenced by practical, material considerations. A suitor's prospects, their ability to earn a living, their family connections that might offer economic advantage, were all carefully weighed. A dowry or bride price in some cultures was not just symbolic, but a crucial economic component of forming a new household. This pragmatic approach doesn't mean that affection couldn't exist or grow, but it does mean that many marriages were contracted on a foundation of mutual need rather than romantic love. For women particularly, marriage was often the only viable path to economic security, however tenuous. If her husband died or became incapacitated, she and her children could be plunged into poverty. This economic dependency shaped women's choices, or lack thereof, in the marriage market. They might have to marry someone they did not love, or even someone much older or less desirable, simply to ensure their survival and that of their family. The romantic ideal of marrying for love was a luxury that many could not afford. Number 6. Forbidden love, when your heart chose wrong. Societal rules about who was an acceptable marriage partner have always been stringent and numerous. Marrying outside one's religion, social class, race, or ethnic group was often forbidden or met with severe social ostracism, legal penalties, or even violence. Love that crossed these boundaries was considered wrong, a transgression against social order and divine will. For instance, in many parts of Europe for centuries, marriage between Christians and Jews, or later between Protestants and Catholics, was prohibited or heavily discouraged. In colonial societies, marriages between European colonizers and indigenous populations or enslaved people were often outlawed or faced extreme prejudice. Even within the same religion or ethnicity, class barriers were rigid. A nobleman marrying a peasant girl, or a wealthy merchant's daughter marrying a poor laborer, was the stuff of scandalous romance precisely because it defied strong social norms. Consequences for such mismatches could be severe: disinheritance, loss of social standing, banishment from the family or community. The individuals involved might be shunned, their children considered illegitimate, or facing discrimination. This meant that the pool of eligible partners in the marriage market was often severely restricted by factors entirely unrelated to personal compatibility or affection. Your heart might lead you to someone, but if they were from the wrong side of a social, religious, or racial divide, that love was doomed or had to be pursued at great personal cost. This created immense personal tragedy for countless individuals whose affections did not align with societal dictates. The market was rigged to maintain existing power structures and social hierarchies, and love that threatened these structures was actively suppressed. This often forced people into marriages with acceptable partners they did not love, leading to quiet despair or resentment. Number 5. The widow's plight, or rare power. When a spouse died, especially the husband, the widow's life could change dramatically, and often not for the better. In many societies, a widow's status was precarious. If she had no sons, or if her sons were young, she might lose control of her husband's property, which could pass to his male relatives. She might be pressured to remarry quickly, often to a brother of her deceased husband, a practice known as levirate marriage, to keep property within the family and ensure she and her children were provided for. While this could offer some security, it also limited her autonomy. In some cultures, like parts of India with the historical practice of sati, now outlawed, a widow was expected or coerced to immolate herself on her husband's funeral pyre, a horrific end to her marriage and life. Even where such extreme customs didn't exist, widows often faced social and economic hardship. They might be seen as a burden on their families or community. Remarriage could be difficult, especially if she was older or had many children. However, in some specific circumstances, widowhood could, paradoxically, offer a woman a degree of independence she never had as a wife. If she inherited property and had the legal right to manage it, which varied greatly by time and place, and if she chose not to remarry, a widow could potentially control her own economic affairs. This was more common for older widows or those from wealthy families. But for most, widowhood meant a loss of status, economic insecurity, and societal pressure. The marriage market for widows was often different too. They might be sought by men looking for an experienced household manager or someone with existing assets, but romantic considerations were often even less prevalent than in first marriages. For young widows, the pressure to remarry and continue bearing children could be intense, pushing them back into the market perhaps with less leverage than before. Number 4. The specter of illegitimacy. The social and legal consequences for children born outside of a formally recognized marriage were often severe and lifelong. An illegitimate child, also referred to by various derogatory terms, typically had no legal rights to inherit property from their father, and sometimes even from their mother. They could face social stigma, discrimination in education and employment, and difficulty in making a good marriage themselves. This intense stigma surrounding illegitimacy placed enormous pressure on women to be married before conceiving a child. Pregnancy outside of marriage could bring shame and ruin not only upon the woman, but also upon her entire family. In many communities, an unmarried pregnant woman might be ostracized, disowned by her family, or forced into a hasty and often disadvantageous marriage to legitimize the child. The father of the child might deny paternity or refuse to provide support, leaving the woman to bear the social and economic burden alone. This fear of illegitimacy heavily policed female sexuality and reinforced the importance of marriage as the only acceptable context for procreation. The marriage market was thus underpinned by this powerful social imperative: marry and marry correctly, to ensure the legitimacy and social standing of your offspring. For a woman, her reputation for chastity was a critical asset in the marriage market. Any suspicion of premarital sexual activity could severely damage her prospects. This created a double standard, as men's premarital sexual exploits were often tolerated or even expected, while women were held to a much stricter code of conduct. The lives of children deemed illegitimate were often marked by hardship and a sense of being lesser than, all because their parents had not conformed to the prevailing marital norms. Number 3. When your body was not your own. Within the historical context of marriage, especially before widespread understanding of consent as we know it today, a woman's body was often not considered her own, particularly regarding sexual relations with her husband. Marital rape was not a recognized concept, legally or socially, for most of history. Upon marriage, a wife was generally understood to have given irrevocable consent to sexual intercourse with her husband whenever he desired it. Refusal could be met with anger, coercion, or even violence, with little legal or social recourse for the wife. This lack of bodily autonomy was a fundamental aspect of the power imbalance inherent in many historical marriages. Women were expected to submit to their husbands' sexual demands, regardless of their own desires, health, or emotional state. This was often tied to the expectation of procreation. A wife's duty was to bear children, and regular intercourse was seen as necessary for this. But it extended beyond procreation to a general sense of male entitlement within the marriage. The idea that a wife had a right to refuse sex or to have her own sexual desires and preferences respected was largely alien. This lack of control over one's own body could lead to unwanted pregnancies, physical discomfort or pain, and deep psychological distress. It turned the most intimate aspect of a relationship into a potential site of subjugation. While some husbands were undoubtedly kind and considerate, the societal and legal framework gave them enormous power over their wives' bodies. The marriage market led women into a contract where their sexual autonomy was effectively signed away, a stark reality that underscored the profound inequalities within the institution for much of history. This lack of agency over one's own physical being is a profound way the system failed individuals. Number 2. No choice, no voice. The arranged marriage default. For a significant majority of people throughout most of history, choosing one's own spouse was simply not an option. Marriages were arranged by parents, guardians, or other family elders. These arrangements were based on a variety of factors, consolidating family wealth, forging alliances between families, ensuring social stability, matching individuals of similar social standing, or simply finding a practical partner for economic survival. Prospective bride and groom, especially the bride, often had little or no say in the matter. They might meet their future spouse for the first time shortly before the wedding, or even on the wedding day itself. Personal preference, romantic attraction, or individual compatibility were rarely primary considerations. The emphasis was on the well-being and strategic interests of the family unit or the wider community rather than the happiness of the individuals involved. While some arranged marriages undoubtedly grew into loving and supportive partnerships, many others resulted in unhappiness, resentment, or quiet endurance. Individuals were expected to subordinate their personal desires to the will of their families and the needs of society. Refusing an arranged match could have serious consequences, including family disapproval, social ostracism, or loss of inheritance. For women, the pressure was often even greater, as marriage was their primary path to social and economic standing. The marriage market, in this context, was not a market where individuals shopped for partners, but one where families negotiated and traded. The lack of personal choice in such a fundamental life decision, who to spend your life with, who to build a family with, represents a profound way in which the historical marriage system failed to meet the individual needs and desires of so many. It prioritized societal structure and familial strategy over personal agency and emotional fulfillment. Number 1. The unseen and unheard, non-heteronormative lives. Throughout most of recorded history, the institution of marriage has been almost exclusively defined as a union between one man and one woman, or in some cultures, one man and multiple women. Individuals who experienced same-sex attraction or whose gender identity did not conform to societal norms found themselves completely outside the recognized marriage mark. There was often no language, no social framework, and certainly no legal recognition for their relationships. Depending on the time period and culture, expressing non-heteronormative desires or living a non-conforming life could lead to severe social stigma, legal punishment, religious condemnation, or even death. People were forced to hide their true selves, to live secret lives, or to enter into heterosexual marriages that were a complete mismatch for their orientations and desires, leading to profound unhappiness for themselves and often for their unknowing spouses. The marriage market simply had no place for them. It was built on a rigid binary and a procreative imperative that excluded anyone who did not fit. This meant that entire segments of the population were denied the possibility of forming recognized, socially sanctioned partnerships, denied the legal protections and social benefits that marriage afforded, and denied the simple human dignity of having their love and relationships acknowledged. They were often invisible in historical records, their stories untold, their emotional lives erased or pathologized. The failure of the marriage market here was absolute. It did not just offer bad choices. For many, it offered no legitimate choices at all, forcing them into lives of pretense, loneliness, or persecution. This exclusion represents one of the most sweeping ways the historical construct of marriage failed to accommodate the diverse spectrum of human love and identity, leaving countless individuals to navigate a hostile world without the support and recognition of a formal partnership.